That's working. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to restart. My name is Peter Brown, chair of the newly incorporated IDESG Incorporation, as well as chair of the Management Council. We're rejigging a little bit the agenda for this afternoon, in the sense that the substance is not going to change, but just the running together of things. Because of Andy's time constraint earlier, we didn't take the NPO update from Jeremy. So what we're going to do is now start off with Jeremy's update from the IDESG National Programme Office. We'll follow that. I will follow that with an update from Management Council and the board of the organisation, and we'll segue straight into the presentations from Kay and from Jim regarding strategic planning and communications planning. And what we'll do is we'll try and play it by ear for having options for taking questions at the various stages through that, and we'll see how we go with the timing. So straight over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thanks, Peter, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to come out for this plenary this January. It's really great to see all of you here in Atlanta this week. And before I get too far, I just wanted to take a moment to thank GTRI for their generosity in hosting and sponsoring this event, as well as LexisNexis and Authentify. We've had a lot of different plenaries. I don't think we've had one that has featured a spread quite like this one. The brownies just now were dangerously delicious. And not helping me, given the pork chop from the diner that I had this morning. Let me also just say it's really nice to be here at a plenary for a change. It was a little unfortunate and I think a bit embarrassing when we had to cancel the October plenary that we were planning to host at NIST after the government shutdown, or slim down, as Fox News called it. Although I got to say that one never made sense to me, both because we were quite definitively shut down, as well as I was baking and eating a lot of pies in my free time, and there was no slimming effect whatsoever. Pies, brownies, pork chop, I got problems with this organization. It was really exciting, I have to say, though, while we were sidelined, to see all of you take the step to proactively shift that plenary to a virtual event, turning what could have been a real disaster into what was a really terrific and productive 3 days. The fact that this happened without our involvement at all in the government was greatly encouraging, and I viewed it as a sure sign that the IDESG has become a privately led organization. The fact that the group formally incorporated as a 501c3 around the same time was also another exciting milestone. The purpose of the grant that we made about 18 months ago to Trusted Federal Systems was to initially form the steering group, help it learn to crawl, walk, ride a bike, basically providing at least the training wheels until the IDESG was ready to pull them off and move forward on its own. And now that the group is formally incorporated and has been engaging in plans to start raising funds of its own, I think we're at a point where the training wheels really are, ready to come off. So congratulations. But I wanted to touch briefly on 4 items today, and the first is actually relating to the training wheels itself and the government's role in facilitating the transition. Specifically talking about, IDESG and what it's done with some of its plans that were presented in a virtual plenary shortly before the new year to start charging membership fees. Our office has been pushing as hard as anybody on this. We've also been listening, however, to many of you in the plenary who have raised concerns that only being 18 months into this effort, we might be moving to tear the training wheels off a bit too soon. Specifically, we've heard from a number of stakeholders who have indicated that while the steering group is doing some great work and making nice forward progress, after an initial first few months that were overwhelmed by discussions of governance, the group is still in the middle of getting its value proposition together. It hasn't quite gelled yet, and the fact that the group is still in the middle of this, there's a concern that we've heard from a lot of you that an effort to start requiring membership fees at a time before this is really gelled could have the impact of making this a significantly smaller and less diverse organization. So I want to tell folks today that this is a set of feedback we've taken to heart because particularly because the sustainment of a vibrant identity ecosystem steering group is a national priority, as you heard from Andy earlier today. And it's really in the interest of the government to ensure that this entity is resourced and incubated properly. So, while we pushed very hard to make sure that the identity ecosystem steering group could incorporate, in large part because we wanted it as an organization to be eligible to apply for any follow-on grants that NIST might make available to support IDESG program activities, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to happen at once. And now that this organization is actually incorporated and is able to be a grant recipient, I'm happy to announce today that from the government side, we're prepared to go just a little bit beyond that, putting forth an opportunity soon for the organization to apply for follow-on grant dollars that would allow the steering group to put off the mandatory collection of membership fees for at least another year. Quite simply, I've come to believe that the organization should not be rushing to require membership fees at a time when this value proposition to its members is still coming together. We're getting closer, mind you, and I think we're going to hear some updates today from the private sector leadership that has been trying to drive this path forward. But I think this is also a very different organization than a traditional trade organization, with what I'd argue is a very different mission and membership than is commonly found in a lot of other nonprofits that are industry focused. As Andy talked about earlier today, you guys have come together to solve a very tough set of problems. In fact, it's one that's so tough that it took government action to help form it. And the fact that the government was involved in that way suggests that the value proposition to folks in the private sector like you may not have been as clear from the start as it would be in a more traditional trade organization. So given this, I think we're of the view it's not surprising that it's taken a little longer than 18 months since its formation for everything to come together. And so from our side, we're going to take steps to make sure that this steering group can continue to move forward for the next year with a focus on its program activities rather than have people divert a lot of energies in the next few months to a formal membership fee drive. The actual mechanism we're going to use to continue to support the steering group is something that we're still exploring. There's a couple different options on the table, but talking to our grants folks, we're pretty confident we should be able to continue to provide support to the organization. I wanted at least today to announce our intentions, because I know it's something that's been on a lot of people's minds, certainly the folks on the Management Council and Board who've been dealing with these issues. And I'd be remiss, by the way, in not taking a moment to acknowledge Kim Little in the back from LexisNexis, who has done absolutely stellar work, both in coming up with the plan for the group to incorporate, as well as developing a schedule for membership fees. We couldn't have gotten where we are as a great group without her. And from our side, you know, our stepping in is really a chance to let the good work that she's done incubate a little bit longer, let the value that this group actually offers from its work products catch up to what I think was a very logical approach for collecting membership fees to begin with. So thank you very much, Kim. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is to let you know that our office is planning to release a solicitation for a third round of NSTIC pilots a little bit later this month. Andy told you a little bit today about the budget news. We'll be level funded for a third year at $16.5 million, a little less than the administration had hoped for. But as Andy was pointing out, in a time where sequester has dominated and a lot of other agency programs are dealing with massive budget cuts, the fact that Congress has found a way to keep this program going at frankly a very healthy level is really quite encouraging, and we've had good bipartisan support in doing so. We are intending once again to carve out some of that money for a third set of pilots. We believe pilots have been really important to help link some of the efforts that are in the strategy and some of the at times theoretical discussions that we get into in this organization with real-world examples of what can actually be done when you start throwing together identity providers and relying parties and end users and testing how different things work, basing them off of the NSTIC and having those lessons learned then feed back into this plenary to help drive deliverables. I can't talk specifically about what will be in the new solicitation, but I can tell you if you want to get an idea of what kind of pilots we'll be looking to fund, there's really two things you should do. One, take a look at the solicitation we put out last year. I think that'll get you a pretty good idea in terms of how we actually approach these things, in terms of what we're looking to solve and evaluation criteria. Second, make sure you're here Thursday morning when the 5 pilots that we awarded this past September will all be presenting. It's another great place to look to see if you want to get an idea of what we think is a really interesting pilot. And you'll see they're all different, but they all are, we think, interesting. One of them, our host here at Georgia Tech Research Institute, actually just launched a site concurrent with this plenary where they're actually posting a tremendous amount of information about the work that they're actually doing, the story behind it, where their research is going, and we're really excited to see them do this. We think it's a good example of what other pilots can do as well in terms of being able to quickly share the results of their work with others in the community. They are focused on how you could actually come up with a feasible approach for trust marks. It's a big issue. Well, Andy Osmond earlier today said he thought it would be the greatest thing we could be doing a year from now is if we actually had an approach for actually issuing trust marks that was vendor neutral, that could be shared across different sectors. It'd be a great White House event, and we're hoping that that pilot and other discussions that are going on within the plenary can help feed into making that a reality this year. The third thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is some of the progress that we're making within the U.S. government on aligning our online services with the NSTIC and supporting standardized credentials for citizen services. Andy mentioned earlier, it's really easy being in the U.S. government. We all march in lockstep. Agencies don't have opinions of their own. Everybody's just happy to listen when a national strategy comes out and align everything. So as hard as it is sometimes, we actually are making some good progress. I think a lot of you have heard a lot about the Federal Cloud Credential Exchange, F6 as it's known, and there will be a Birds of a Feather session tomorrow around lunchtime with some updates on it. The F6 is on track to go live this spring. And a bit of new news, and I think it is big news, the government is also about to take a big step forward in moving forward with the plan to create a single approach for government to actually purchase standardized authentication services that will enable agencies to more easily share authentication services across government. In simple terms, while the F6 is the infrastructure to actually enable shared credentials, we've still had a hole in terms of standardizing how we buy them. And as a result, what we've seen across the government is agencies that have been moving forward with some LOA3 type non-PKI solutions have all been buying different solutions that don't interoperate with each other, which is a problem both for us as taxpayers as well as customers and citizens of these sites. As Andy mentioned earlier, if I'm one guy who's a veteran, a college student, and a taxpayer, and I've got to get 3 different credentials that are all kind of the same thing and also going through the same identity proofing process to get it, that's not really helping anybody at the end of the day. We shouldn't have to get multiple credentials in order to do business with the government online. So we think it's time to change the way we actually buy and the model we use to pay for these services. The solicitation that should be coming forward shortly won't be coming from NIST. The GSA is leading things here. And I can't and won't really say anything more about it than the little bit I'm going to talk about here. But I think the one thing that's interesting about where we're going as the government is actually not planning to pay for credentials, but rather authentication services. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it leaves it actually up to the private sector to figure out how to roll in the price of things like identity proofing and token issuance, credential management. We're not paying for that, only the actual authentication service. And second, it allows industry to be compensated for government authentication of credentials that may not have originally been issued for government purposes. So long as there's credentials that are out there in the wild that are FICAM compliant, meaning they've been certified by one of the trust framework providers that the GSA's approved, a firm that might have issued such a credential to a customer for a purely commercial purpose could then gain additional revenues from that credential the first time that the customer used the credential to actually authenticate at the government site. So given the desire that we have to drive a model where the government makes use of existing credentials in the ecosystem rather than one where everything's essentially designed just for the U.S. government purposes, we think this approach has the potential to significantly change the economics of the industry in a way that can significantly catalyze adoption of a broader identity ecosystem. Again, since NIST is not running the procurement and it's coming soon, I can't say much more than that, but I do thought talking about how the model is shifting a little bit in terms of how the government actually wants to buy would be of interest to this group, and obviously it also puts some folks in the room on notice that this may be happening soon. The final thing I wanted to touch on before we get into the rest of our presentation, and ties directly into what Andy spoke about a little earlier today, is the recent work that the Identity Ecosystem Group Policy Coordination Committees conducted. Andy spoke on this a little bit earlier. Some of you may recall when this body met back at MIT in July, we challenged all of you to contemplate what potential policy incentives the U.S. government could put forth through legislation, through regulation, through leveraging the government's purchasing power that would help remove barriers to the identity ecosystem and help catalyze its activity. This tied directly into a broader set of activities Andy described earlier that the administration's been looking at around the concepts of incentives that can drive broader adoption of good cybersecurity practices. Based on the challenge, Dan Chenuk from IBM, who's not here, although I think he's participating virtually this week as the chair of the Policy Coordination Committee, Dan and others in the committee launched an effort where they solicited input both from existing steering group members and perhaps even more importantly, some major stakeholders who had chosen to not currently involve themselves with NSTIC or the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, and asked both groups, to get their input on what incentives might actually drive their participation in and support of efforts to implement the NSTIC. So the committees produced a draft report, and not surprisingly, they found there aren't any easy silver bullets that are out there, but there are a number of good ideas. including ones that tie back to the broader cybersecurity policy discussion going on in Washington right now. We've already taken the liberty of sharing the draft with the White House and others involved in the exercise as a way of getting some of the ideas that were generated by the efforts of this organization on the table in policy discussions as quickly as possible. The report itself, I know, is on the steering group website under the Policy Coordination Committee, and we're quite pleased to see this go forward. We think it was a really valuable contribution to some of the broader legislative debates and whatnot that are going on around cybersecurity in Washington. So with that, I have said most of what I wanted to say, and we can get on with the event unless people had a couple questions before I start. And if nobody has any, then we can move on.
Yeah, come on later.
Sure. And I'll obviously be around the next few days if you do have questions, so thanks for coming.
Thanks, Jeremy. What I want to do over the next few minutes is not to dive into detail of what the board and the management council have been doing in the last few months, because I think that's something that Kay and Jim will do on a couple of priority areas of work, but rather just to give you a flavour of some of the key issues that we're facing. Following the online plenary last October and the follow-up meetings in November, and with the assent of the plenary, we went ahead with incorporation of IDESG as a loose, non-incorporated association, as a formally incorporated body under the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We did that both for the 501c3 and for the 501c6, although for the latter, we're not activating anything in that area yet because we're not using that structure at the moment. But we've done the process of incorporation, and what we've been doing in the meantime, it's only been 2 meetings since we've incorporated, a lot of it has been looking at the initial governance issues and fiduciary responsibilities of the new structure. So the board had its first sort of constitutive meeting at which it had to elect its own officers, so the officers of the corporation. At that meeting, I was elected as president and chair of the board. Kay Shockley-Cohen, who has been acting as executive director for the unincorporated IDESG organization, was elected as the secretary to the corporation. And Kim Little, who we mentioned and who's hiding there in the back, was elected as the treasurer of the corporation. And just to remind you, these are requirements by law of an incorporated entity, and particularly for a 501 not-for-profit organization. So our first meeting was very much focused on electing the officers, going through some processes of due diligence, having a discussion about roles and responsibilities as members of the board, and looking at the issues of ensuring that we have the initial set of bylaws, which we adopted without modification, the draft that we'd already published to the plenary and had discussions with the plenary. Over the course of the last 2 meetings, including the meetings we had yesterday and this morning, there have been 4 major areas, and again, we'll be looking at those in some more detail, but there's been a common pattern, I think, across all of those 4 areas, whether that's on incorporation, the transition to being an incorporated and self-sustained organization, the issue of fee schedules and membership dues, or the issue about strategic planning. I think all of these core issues, which are responsibilities of the Management Council and the board, have been marked by extensive consultation with the plenary, very much a listening exercise from our side to actually take on board those constructive criticisms and comments made by members of the plenary and to try and take those into our consideration, to adjust our thinking and our ideas and decisions in light of that. And as we'll see, even on the issue of the fee schedule, we put together what we thought was the best option at the time, and we got some pushback from plenary and from a number of comments about the way that we're going forward from that. And as a result, we took off the table that initial proposal, and we're going to work on it further. So I think this process which is very much in the spirit of what we said when we moved to incorporation, of extensive consultation, adjustment of our approach and ideas before taking decisions, but ultimately accepting that both by law and by the organisational structure, the elected board has a fiduciary responsibility for looking after the organisational health. This raises a second and sort of rather curious and slightly uncomfortable issue, which we tried to look at a little bit at the meeting yesterday afternoon and this morning, and that is, okay, we have a management council elected through a process laid down in the rules of association, and where the plenary is sovereign, and where the management council broadly represents the different interest groups that are active in this organisation. And we say that the board is automatically the members of the elected management council. So that raised the question, well, why do we have both? And although we don't have an answer on that, and we will certainly be opening a sort of consultation process around this and looking for feedback and input, there is a sense that just merging the two together and just doing away with the management council or doing away with the board and just having a single body might actually fail the organisation in terms of identifying two clear, or what we think are broadly clear, profiles of responsibilities. On the one hand, with the management council, it should be the interlocutor for the plenary and for the committees in terms of driving the overall policy and work of the organisation forward. Whereas the board should be concentrating on the fiduciary and oversight responsibilities of ensuring that the organisation has the wherewithal and the structure to be able to carry that work. So on one side, the board is responsible, if you like, for the structure and the platform, and the management council is there to help with actually driving policy and decision-making forward. Where the lines, where the overlap is there and where drawing the line between those two is not immediately obvious, but that's something we need to look at, and we will need to come back to the plenary with some specific suggestions on. And some of the work starting on that will be today when we have the presentation on strategic goals and priority objectives. Just as a reminder, the sort of core functions of the Management Council have been to sort of monitor progress in policy development and the work of the organisation, and has a sort of moral obligation to ensure that the work being done remains true to the key goals laid out in the national strategy document, and to echo Andy's comments earlier about that, trying to keep us in that focus point, that sort of sweet spot between what's technologically possible, what's desirable from the point of view of public policy, and what is publicly acceptable. That sort of trying to keep us in that sweet spot is, I think, one of the key elements to driving the organisation forward, and the Management Council clearly has a role in that. But it's also there to provide support and guidance in IDESG policy making. And if I'm very frank, I think that's one area where we could do better. There is a sense, sometimes we sense it both in the Management Council, and members active in various committees sense it as well, of sometimes a bit of a disconnect, that the committees are getting on doing the work, they're bringing the stuff to the plenary, but somehow there's this sort of strange body out here, the Management Council, that's not really listening to them. I think we need to think more about that, and about how the Management Council can engage with and across the committees in helping ensure that we keep the work driving forward. The other area which responsibility has been sort of the IDSG's relationships with the outside world, so third-party organisations. We've been very limited in our external communications to date, in terms of whether it's in terms of press releases or outreach work directly, and that's tied up with the whole issue of the evolution of our value proposition, our vision, mission statements that we looked at in the last virtual plenary. But it will remain a responsibility for the IDSG, and that is also true at a very formal level in terms of formal liaisons with external bodies. As you may know from a previous announcement, we have a formal liaison with Kantara Initiative, and Management Council is looking now at another one, which is with the European Association, EMA, to look at, if not a formal liaison, some sort of reciprocal arrangement with them where our members can get involved in their work and their members can get involved in our work. So those are some of the ideas. Layered on top of that now, we have, for the board, very clear fiduciary responsibility for organisational governance, and that's something which we need to really focus on as a board. I mentioned about the role of management council relationship with committees. I think where we have been very successful, and again we'll look at that in a bit more detail with Kay's presentation, is developing this idea of the activities dashboard and having a sort of overview of all committee work and sort of seeing how we're progressing to various objectives that have been identified as important and as priority. And I think the management council role has been sort of to gently ease that forward and get that conversation going. But I think more attention is needed. I think we need to be more receptive and linking in with the work of the committees. And I think also we should be looking at opportunities or the need even for supporting committee leaderships, committee chairs, in helping them understand their function and to give them the sort of air cover they might need in terms of ensuring that they get to points of clear decision making, clear decisions in their work, and don't feel that they get sort of caught up in process or worries about whether they are conforming or operating in accordance with the rules of association or not. And I think we have a responsibility there to them to help that move forward. The final thing I wanted to talk about, which is much more the responsibility of the board, is the question more broadly about organisational health. Whether it's on the issue of the budget, it's the board that will, at the end of the day, have to ensure that the organisation has the financial means to be able to deliver on the various activities that it wishes to fund. This is going to be both an iterative process and an interactive process with the committees and people involved in activities. In the same way that any organisation draws up its budget, it depends on input from the people who want to see things done. That's why we want to use the activities dashboard and that process of working with committees to get a sense from committees of, if resources were available, this is what we would like to do. Now, I should underline, this doesn't mean that because you say you want something, you're going to get it, because politics is the art of the possible, and the board's responsibility is trying to mediate between competing demands to see what can be funded. So it's not either just a financial issue, it's a question of human resources. In many committees we hear comments about, oh well, if we had more time to do that, or if we weren't bogged down with this issue, we'd be able to do this better and we'd be able to do that better. And I think what we have to look at as a board is how we work with committees to make their work advance more clearly against the various objectives, and at a time when we are able to mobilise our own resources, whether it's through additional funding, through the IDESG MPO, or at a later stage through our own resources through membership fees. The key responsibility of the board will be to be responsive to the activities that committees want to do and ensure that we're driving towards the core objectives of the organisation. In that light, and Jeremy hinted that to me, that the fact of incorporation is actually a prerequisite to us being able to be a recipient of any grant money in the future, not whether it's from the IDESG MPO or for any other source. We need to have some basic elements in place. So we're incorporated, we have a set of officers. This week we're due to do some of the basic paperwork of setting up bank accounts and getting the pieces in place that ensure that we have the elements necessary to be able to attract funding and opportunities going forward. The last element I wanted to cover, and I didn't really want to finish on an alarmist or negative point, but it's an important one, so I did leave it till last. We have in the rules of association as they currently stand a clause and a provision which could lead to, and we've heard various apocalyptic terms to refer to it. There's the nuclear meltdown, the Management Council euthanasia clause, and various other things. But before worrying you too much, we have basically in the rules of association a rule governing concerning term limits. This issue came up because the board's responsibility is to ensure governance and continuity of the organisation. And it was pointed out to us by our lawyer quite reasonably that a one-year election cycle and no continuity from one election to another is a potential risk for any organisation, that there needs to be some sort of continuity. And what we have in the Rules of Association today is a rule that says very clearly, and for reasons which we all understand were put in there, of that no elected member of the Management Council can serve for more than 2 consecutive terms of office. So we're about to go into an election cycle which would be the beginning of the second full term of the Management Council. So theoretically, if every one of the current Management Council members were to re-stand and be re-elected, we would face a situation in April 2015 where there would be, and would require to be, a 100% turnover of the Management Council and thus the board. And I think there was absolute consensus in the discussion we had in the board yesterday and the council this morning that this is not a good idea for the organisation. So at some point, and we put the problem on the table, we put the problem out there, we need to address it. There's no immediate panic. We can go ahead with the election schedule as we have it. But at some point during the next semester, we're going to have to address through a rule change and some maybe a bit of nifty footwork in terms of either looking to a proportion of the Management Council being either on a volunteer or being press-ganged, and with the assent of the plenary to serve a 2-year term, and then to start an election process next year for electing another half, so that when you then have not only a 2-year term but a staggered 2-year term, or some other formula. These are just ideas off the top of our heads and from a quick brainstorming we had this morning. The important thing is something needs to change there. And the reason we mention that now, even if we're not going to be able to address it and resolve it this week, is because the election nominations are coming up. So it's something to bear in mind. Not only, obviously, we want to encourage as many people to stand for election for all of the posts across the organisation, but to bear in mind that getting elected this year, there may be further on in 2014 a request and some backed up by a rule change as needed for whoever is elected, or for a proportion of the people who are elected, to be willing to extend that term or to come up with some other formula that allows us to ensure organisational continuity by not having to renew all the officers every single year, but also to have a staggered term limit so that you are able to pass the baton on across the generations of the organisational leadership over the years. So that's where I wanted to wrap up there. As I say, we'll go into more detail in the moment with Kay or Jim, but as with Jeremy, if there are any questions on those high-level points, I'm happy to take those now. Those brownies were good, huh? Yeah. Okay, if not, then without any further ado, Kay, I hand over to you to take us through the next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Laura, I forgot to ask you, do you advance these slides or can I do it? John will be doing that for me? All right. When he finds my PowerPoint. As I was sitting listening, and I thought to myself about the timing of our meeting, I should have, instead of calling this sort of an executive director's report in the agenda, I should have thought about that January is when the president gives his State of the Union and the governors do their State of the States, and I could have done a State of the IDESG, but I didn't think about that before. So, but that is kind of what I would like to present to you today, is to talk a little bit about how far we've come and where we're headed for 2014. And the timing of this meeting was perfect to be able to kind of pull all of those things together. John, would you go to the next slide? And actually, what you're going to see that I've kind of pulled together are things that have already been highlighted by Bob Blakely, by Jeremy Grant, and by Peter Brown, because I really want to make sure that we are capturing, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about a lot of the progress we've made and where we're headed. And sometimes there's a lot of things happening in components in separate committees, and I'm not sure that all of that kind of gets brought together. So that's what I want to try to do this afternoon with you. So what I want to do first of all is I want to bring you up to speed on what happened, where we left off, if you will, at the end of 2013. We had a virtual plenary in October, but then we had an online plenary meeting in November to talk about a straw proposal for fee schedule. So I want to kind of tell you what happened with that and all the feedback we got. I also want to bring you up to speed and make sure everyone realizes all of the different components and work we've done on the strategic planning process, which are not just the outside consultants we brought in, but a lot of work that's gone in internally. And then to talk a little bit about our next steps for 2014. So let me start with a summary of the fees discussions. So as I said, we had an online plenary in November of 2013, and the Management Council had put together a straw proposal for possible fee schedules. And after that meeting, we had, well, first of all, during the meeting, we had lots of comments and questions. After that, then we opened up another 2-week period for more comments. So a lot of things came in. The board of directors, since it has the fiduciary responsibility, met to read those comments and take a look and decide what the next step was. What came out of that was it was clear that the schedule as it was proposed was not supported. And so the board of directors is going to work to find a better approach in collaboration with the plenary and the management council. So there were some good suggestions made. Could we go to the next slide? From the plenary. And I think now we just have to build on that. And so a couple of things. Uh-oh, this is not the most current version. Oops. Well, that's okay. I'll keep going and I'll just let you know. Okay. The left side, okay. One of the things that was very apparent in the comments in the discussion was that the diversity of the stakeholder groups is critical to this organization, and therefore we have to develop a model that ensures the balance in that membership. And especially important, that many folks pointed out, is that involvement and the participation of consumer groups and privacy advocates. So we want to make sure we take that into account going forward. Much of that was taken into account in the initial, but what we got back was we need to do some more things with that. So we want to keep that in the mix and not discard it. But also a very clear message was that value propositions need to be developed and that more work regarding nonprofits, for-profits, and the appropriate treatment of those is also necessary. So, okay. There we go. So next steps in this fee schedule discussion we're having. First of all, no fee schedule will be imposed at this time until these issues have been resolved, right? So we heard what you said, we're paying attention, we're going to try to do something different. Secondly, the board is working, and as Peter said, since we've actually stood up our own corporation, there's only been an opportunity for a couple of meetings, and some of which have really, as Peter pointed out, had to focus on legal requirements, right? So by law, they had to elect officers, and by law, they had to go through their bylaws, and so forth and so on. But so now they're taking steps to develop an operational budget so they can better assess the financial situation. I think that was also one of the feedback that was given. And in the short term, and we're very appreciative of the fact that NIST was listening along with the board, and they were paying attention to what you had to say. And so they agreed to sort of help us in the short term and provide some funding to cover those interim operational costs while we focus on how do we come up with another model that works better. So I think all of that said, it was a really good example of how the process of the IDESG has worked. And I'm really pleased that we were able to work through that. Obviously it's not complete. And so for 2014, we have to get this figured out. We certainly don't want to create an organization that has to be fully dependent on federal funding. And I think you all know that. So did I do that or did you do that? Oh, sorry. I looked over there. Okay. So anyway, enough about that. And if when I'm done with kind of this, if you have questions, let me know. But I wanted to also just make sure everybody was on the same page with the strategic planning that we've been doing. I want to kind of go over the process and the current work, but also some next steps for 2014. And before I do that, in some ways, we kind of did this in reverse. There was a lot of work that was done by the Management Council and their Work Planning Subcommittee. There was a lot of work that's been done by the chairs and the committees. And then we also, as you recall, this past summer, brought on some outside consultants to help us kind of pull some things together. And they did a lot of listening in a lot of settings. So they did individual interviews, they did small group meetings, they did larger groups. You may remember they presented at the virtual plenary last October. And out of that, we also had an extended comment period. So those consultants were focused on specific pieces of our strategic planning process, but they were very engaged and really reached out to the plenary a lot. So let me just kind of go through some of the things. They pulled this chart together, and I thought it might be helpful for you to see what they heard from member inputs were the greatest accomplishments so far of the IDESG. You see that first column was the makeup of the organization, bringing diverse stakeholders together around a common issue. Again, that comment about diversity, which is clearly a key component of what this organization is and stands for. The strength in the committees. The components all support the standard framework. Other comments about momentum, keeping the core team engaged and adding stakeholders and keeping the momentum going, which we've begun to talk about in this session. And I think we want to continue to talk about how do we do that without burning all of you out and yet keep you engaged and making sure that you can concentrate on the expertise you bring to the table. Awareness. Raising awareness particularly within the government about the challenges of internet identity and some tangible results. Already solving the problem in the real world and standards are aligning, and that gives some examples. And that the pilots, I love this, you can tell it was from a participant, are adding some sizzle. I don't know who said that, but I could venture a guess. There we go. Some other member inputs that they put together that I thought you might like to see were some things that people said, this is what success would look like for the IDESG. So some of the folks said the White House says the IDESG delivered the strategy and the objectives. Others said that there will be clear rules of the road and an environment that's secure, interoperable, easy to use, and privacy enhancing. That success might look like that the concept of trusted ID online is a household phrase and it's transparent to citizens. When you, the consumer, can shop around for an identity credential, choose a provider in terms, and live your daily life with nobody saying, we don't take that. And the last example of what folks thought would be success is when we have all the identity providers and relying parties as IDESG members agreeing to a common framework. So this was input from various folks, and I think it was very helpful to sort of hear at an aspirational level, what are we going for? Here were some strategic agreements, and by this, the consultants listening to all the folks that they talked to, all the comments they got, were places where they saw agreement that we might be able to build on going forward. One is the aligning of the IDESG mission with the NSTIC vision and principles. Someone called it the True North. A focus on benefits and outcomes that would be aspirational, moving beyond the structure and the governance issues. Conveying a distinct point of view or difference. The IDESG has that, as opposed to some of the other organizations that are out there. Incorporate a healthy dose of abstraction in the language referring to our strategic planning process to allow flexibility and position the IDESG for the future. Adopt an active voice to convey our leadership as an organization and our momentum. Use straightforward, simple language, and showcase the pilots, but also other tangible and practical solutions. So this is a chart that if any of you have been involved in strategic planning before, I'm sure you've seen something very similar. This is sort of the typical building blocks of what it takes to put together that approach. The mission and the vision that you see was where we brought in the outside consultants. But I want to go through and point you to the places where, as an organization, we already focused on those strategic goals and objectives and the actions and the initiatives. And if you haven't taken a look at some of that, I want to encourage you to do that. But we've actually done this entire process. And now in 2014, we need to decide where do we go from here and begin to build on that, what worked and what didn't, and where are the places we need to make some changes. So based on the input after the last virtual plenary and that comment period, here is a working draft of the mission statement. So the one in the red box: promote secure, user-friendly ways to give individuals and organizations confidence in their online interactions. So that, oh, thank you. No, you're good, it's fine. And then along with that, they drafted a vision statement based on the input from everyone. A world where people trust the security and privacy of online identification and the exchange of personal data. And they also took, because we had got a lot of feedback actually about value propositions, which I think is very good. And given the comments that we got in the fees schedule, right, about needing to really make this more concrete, it was very helpful that we've sort of got a start on this. And what a lot of folks had to say was that the IDESG addresses an increasingly important national priority, navigating the new identity-enabled online world. Citizens, business, and government act together to remove the barriers to trusted interactions. Okay, and along with that, sort of as they're gathering the value proposition, they're also able to gather information about the differentiator. Laura, is this really the most current PowerPoint you have? Because I'm about to get to slides that I don't think you have. Okay. All right, so the differentiator is our unique value comes from integrating cross-sector industry leadership with individual privacy perspectives and public policy. This independent collaborative partnership enhances choice, protects civil liberties, and stimulates innovation. Okay, so that was the feedback, the input, the information we got using those outside consultants. Now I want to move you to a lot of strategic planning work that's already gone on within the membership, and point you to some of those things just as a reminder that we've actually established a lot of these things. So first of all, if you remember last spring, in April of 2013, the Management Council and their work planning subcommittee actually proposed a work plan that was accepted. The work plan itself had 3 goals, like big overarching strategic goals outlined. Each of those goals, they had drafted strategic objectives, and the actions and initiatives to achieve the goals and objectives were documented by committees and ad hoc groups and are now incorporated into a priority action item dashboard. So I'm going to walk you through what some of those things were. So the work plan, as I said, that was developed in 2013, these were the 3 strategic goals. One was to establish IDESG priority objectives. And it was posed as asking the question, what must the IDESG accomplish in 2013 and beyond? And you'll recall Bob talked about what some of those accomplishments were, and it was actually quite a list. The second goal was to identify priority activities. What specific work activities are required to meet the priority objectives? And the third goal was to address any IDESG structural issues. Is the current structure appropriate for achieving the IDESG goals? So those were the 3 overarching goals. Okay, so from that, if you drill down a little deeper, right, the next step was to look more at priority objectives. So we had the bigger, broader goals. Now we start to drill down a little bit in more detail. So priority objectives for 2013, first was develop a self-sustainment plan, which was done. And as Jeremy pointed out, we have a great deal to thank Kim Little and her subcommittee for having put that together. Frankly, from having taken all kinds of ideas of what kind of an organization we should be to actually now being our own incorporated entity. So we have that committee to thank for having moved us to action in really a relatively short period of time. Now the next thing will be to implement that, and we've been talking about revenue and all kinds of other things we need to talk about. But so we are off and running. Establish and implement an accreditation and trustmark program that has now been scoped to the TIFDM committee. They had their first breakout this afternoon. Develop an accreditation program for an initial set of NSTIC pilots. That was one of the priority objectives, and that is now being revisited by the Management Council and Board. So, establish liaison relationships. Those are underway. Peter referenced those for you. Establish and implement a framework development and adoption process, which is also underway with the TIFDM. And by the way, if I can put in a plug here, tomorrow morning we will be hearing in a general session from the TIFDM committee leadership. Jack Seuss, the chair, and Andrew Hughes, the vice chair, will be talking about a lot of this work. So it'll be an excellent opportunity for you to hear more about this work that's underway. Accomplishments in 2013, and Bob Blakely actually kind of listed these out, so all I've done is document what he kind of said to you this morning. The risk-based privacy evaluation methodology was adopted, the survey on incentives was completed by the policy committee, the catalog of the international identity framework efforts was compiled by the International Coordination Committee, taxonomy completed a 1.0 glossary, and that is in the privacy committee for review. Why am I? There we go. The committees have developed a dashboard, which they're now using, as he pointed out, to run their meetings. The interim identity framework draft was completed by the TIFDM, and that will also be talked about in some of these other sessions throughout this week. And HHS credentialing requirements for hospitals which accept Medicare were harmonized with NIST 800.63, which I think we have the healthcare committee to thank. So those are quite a few things that actually were addressed and completed in 2013. So now, looking at 2014, you see the question mark, we need to take a look at what are our priority objectives for this year. So in working with the leadership, we have put together sort of a proposed list. The Management Council worked on this as well this morning. Establish and implement a framework development and adoption process, which is part of ongoing work from 2013, articulation of the identity ecosystem and IDESG role, outline for an identity ecosystem framework, develop and deliver a vendor-neutral trustmark program to complement the interim framework, which enables IDPs and RPs to more readily participate in the identity ecosystem. And lastly, to enroll external organizations in the core mission of the IDESG. So that's moving us to this coming year. If you recall, one of the other overarching goals of the work plan that was done focused on structural issues. So there were specific committees that were recommended to be reviewed from the original work plan in April of 2013. To take you back in time, TIFDM had to be reorganized and was sort of started and restarted in the summer last year, so after this plan was put in place. The Privacy Committee, I think, was working on the PEM and some of those other issues then, what their role should be. The International Committee had some reorganization. We have some sector-specific committees. The User Experience Committee is one in which there will actually be a birds of a feather session talking a little bit about that work and what needs to happen. Also, the Management Council created several subcommittees. The Communications and Outreach, what was in existence will now be closed, and now in a moment we'll talk with Jim Barnett, and he's going to talk a little bit about how we're going to rescope that, because now we're in a different place about what we need for our communications and outreach. The Business Plan and Transition Subcommittee, which did so much work and has ended. The Goals and Work Planning Subcommittee also put together a lot of this, and I'm going to describe in a minute more of those. There was a Rules Review Subcommittee, and there was a Holistic Visualization Subcommittee, all of which had very specific projects, and once those were done, they went on. And of course, structural issues needing to have a board of directors as we move to self-incorporation. There we go. Okay, work items. Now we're drilling down even further into the actual work activities. The committees have established work plans, and they report to the plenary chair on a regular basis. And with that, we created a dashboard. The dashboard for priority action items is located at that link on the IDESG website. It is updated after every chair's call, and it basically documents what are the work items for each committee and where are they in the process and the flow of moving through the IDESG itself. So is it something that's, when is it scheduled to come out? Has the privacy committee reviewed it? Has the management council reviewed it? Is it ready to come to the plenary? All of those steps are in there, and it gives you an opportunity in a snapshot to see a lot of the work that's in progress across all the committees and the management council. So I encourage you, if you haven't taken a look at that, to do so. As I said, it's updated about every 2 weeks. And so in that process, the chairs are reporting to each other, to the chairs, to the management council. The dashboard also, as I just mentioned, indicates the flow of those work items and their anticipated dates of completion. And one of the new items that Peter referenced in his remarks is that as we are now our own organization and we want to begin to develop a meaningful operational budget, we need to look at identifying resource requirements for some of the priority activities. We won't have infinite amounts of money, but we need to begin to be more targeted and specific. Okay, I don't know what happened there. We've done the review here, so I'm not sure how that bullet is still there, but so I wanted to go over that with you. I wanted to make sure everyone knew about all the work that's gone on and that it wasn't just outside consultants who came in and said, here's what you should do. In fact, there's been a great deal of input, and I think that while it takes time, one of the greatest strengths of the IDESG is not just the diversity, but the engagement from all of you. So those are our next steps as we look to 2014. Certainly as your executive director, I want to make a commitment to try to improve our communication and our member services, if you will, to find better ways to help structure and support the work of the members and the committees so that what you bring to the table you can really focus on, and hopefully I can help get rid of any of the noise. But I did want to just briefly thank the board and the officers and the management council and all of you. We have come a long way. I hope you pat yourselves on the back and realize that. And I'm very appreciative of the chance to work with all of you. So I'm going to turn my time over now to Jim Barnett to talk about... Oh, are there any, I guess, questions? I think it's all you.
Left side, okay.
The left side.
Oh, is mine on a separate deck? How do I? Okay, great, thank you. While they're doing that, I'll just, first of all, good afternoon. I realize that the social hour is nigh, so I'm going to try and keep this pretty brief. First of all, I just want to extend personal thanks to all the members of the Communications and Outreach Committee who have spent the last year and a half working on our various issues. I want to make a particular call out to Russ Chung, who is here, and also to Judith Fleener, who spent a lot of hours volunteering and putting in a lot of effort and didn't ask for any recognition, but that's the kind of work that really makes this place go. So I just want to make a call out to them for that, so thank you very much. Also want to thank Kay and Peter for their leadership on this and helping me think through some of the ideas we have to address now that we are an independent organization. So, there we go. So we, actually I'm going to go back up one if we could just for now. So what we've been doing for the last few months, really since I came into this role, I guess really back in April, is we've been trying to rethink what we need to do as an organization that is independent, that is not unincorporated, but actually has some responsibilities beyond just as a volunteer organization. So we've been rethinking that, and I want to harken back to the slide that Kay had that had the building blocks of strategic planning. So think about, we have now a mission, a working mission statement and a vision statement. And so now what I'm going to talk about briefly here is really just the strategic objective level. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about tactics, but really just sort of an objective that can bring together those tactics and also help us see how they live together. So we started to work on a goal here, really how to transition the communications and outreach functions to support IDESG as an independent nonprofit corporation. So it really falls into really three categories, I think. There's work that as has been done, can still be done by volunteers in this organization, and that should continue. We talked about that a bit today in the Management Council, and those are things like issues about how we connect and doing collaboration, but also connecting into plenaries and other working sessions, and also the onboarding of members. That was a big success in July in Cambridge. I was not there, but I heard just great things about that. So those are the kind of things that volunteers do well, and we want to continue that. There's also, as an independent organization, some things we're probably going to need to do that'll be done professionally, that can be coordinated out of the main office of IDESG. So we'll get to more of those in just a minute, but there are things like press releases and that sort of thing that we really can't count on people doing in their spare time, or if they've got something else that's a priority in their day job to take that over. And thirdly, one of the things I've been trying to give particular focus to is that we have limited resources. We know that, and it's going to be that way for a while. So we've been trying to think about some creative ways that we can leverage, really leverage the assets and the resources of member organizations that are household names that are members of IDESG and support what we do. So I want to show you just the current structure right now, just to review. The structural challenge we have really is twofold. The chart you see here is pretty broad. We're doing pretty much everything except slicing, dicing, and making julienne fries. We're tasked with creating a consumer-facing brand and trust mark, for example. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to need some help with. And when we first started out, this was something that we could think about as a committee, but I think as we're moving forward and we're hoping to develop that trust mark, we're going to need to bring in some help. And also, we just haven't had the guns, frankly. We have a committee of about, I think, a dozen or more people. We've had about a handful who have participated and done the work of the committee, and we just don't have the resources or, in some cases, all the right skills to accomplish the things that are on this list right here. And slide 4. So here's our emerging needs. So as broad as that charter was, it's going to be bigger as an independent organization. We're going to have to do some things that we didn't need to do when we were unincorporated. So again, things like press releases, annual reports, that sort of thing. Some of these things are fairly rote, but some things are going to require some continuous attention. And so things also like social media support. Social media obviously is something we all do, but we need to have somebody who is keeping track of that and making sure that our messages are somewhere in the same ballpark. So we're going to need some professional help here. And one of the ways, again, I would like to explore further is how we can leverage some resources that are available to us, perhaps within our member organizations here. And one of the things that I've given particular attention to is how we might be able to sync up with some organizations that already have some pretty well-established relationships in place. In particular, I'm thinking about media relations and how household names that are in this room can help us connect to reporters and get our message out there. So again, now that we have our mission, our vision statement, and we're developing some value propositions, how do we get some earned media, some attention to that? So those are some of the things we're looking at. And I just would offer you a quick example of that. I've detected a little bit of a disconnect between the folks who are here and who belong to some pretty big companies or organizations, and the folks who do the messaging for those organizations. And I had a conversation with one yesterday was somebody I knew from a previous life, and I just said, "Did you know, by the way, that your company is part of this group?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I think I sort of knew that." He's like, "Yeah, yeah." And so he looked up some things, and he's like, "Oh yeah, IDESG," and we talked about, again, the mission statement we have here, and he got really excited, and he said, "You know what? This is the kind of thing we can get behind." And he made a commitment to me that he's going to find the appropriate person within their media relations department to help us sync up the messaging of IDESG in that particular company, which is a member here. So that's the kind of thing I'm hoping to do more of. And if we can bring more resources on board, and we've got, again, organizations that already have the channels established, and they start pulling in, talking about IDESG, that helps us get our awareness out there. It helps us make our value proposition more robust. So that's one of the things I would like to do. And so, in closing, I'm going to offer you my contact information here. Again, I'm open to some ideas about how we can leverage more resources, but in particular, I would like to put out a call, and Kay and I have discussed actually doing this in a more formal way later, but on that first point about the volunteer organization of communications, where we're doing how we relate to each other, how we sync up, how we collaborate, how we do online plenaries, and how we onboard. If you're interested in that kind of thing and you have some skills to offer, and you come with a real solution orientation, I would invite you to come forward sometime after this. I'll be at the social hour. We can talk about it more then, but with that, I would open it to questions. Oh, I just mentioned, I think the best way to reach me of all those is my email. I read that most often, so thank you very much. Yes. Sorry.
I think it's from the remote office.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey,
Oh, yes.
can you hear me? Okay. We have a question from Anne Rakuya Robbins, and she said she wants to ask who will control the metadata and the information architecture, the plenary, the communications committee, or the external people?
I'm going to hand that over to our executive director, I think. I'm not really.
Yeah, I'll read it again. I know time is short, so I wanted to ask this question. Who will control the metadata and information architecture, the plenary, the communications committee, the external people?
Well, I can say it would not be the communications committee, because I think that's an asset. It's not really something that we would do as part of communications, but I think that's an asset for the organization, I would think, in some way.
Yeah.
Peter, you want to take that one?
I'm just looking for more clarification. I mean, and it's difficult with a remote participant, I know, but I'm not clear, unless anyone else in the room can clarify, metadata and information architecture of what? Of our website, of the future identity ecosystem? I mean, I really don't know, and I'm not being facetious here. It's difficult to understand. We can get some feedback from Anne on that. In the meantime, if there are any other questions. Yes, please.
So, I mean, you've just always been doing very constructive and important work, and I was wondering, could you speak a little more about what types of things would be constructive, especially out here, with the plenary? I know there's a committee structure. Are there other things that that have come up, or that you could think of that would be that you could maybe share with us when you say that you're looking for help or assistance in ways, like stuff we can be thinking about and maybe start to jump in while we have the plenary all together?
Well, again, just going my brief tenure in this role when I came in back in April, the real grist of our conversations on the calls have really been about two things that I've been able to detect. I mean, it's been really about, and actually some of these issues have been resolved. I mean, we had a discussion about this in the management council today, but the issues about how we connect, even just the technology of it, is it sufficient? Is it working? Is it platform agnostic, that sort of thing, which is a little bit out of my bailiwick. I'm not a technologist, but those are the kind of things that I tried to help get resolved, and we talked about, and I think they were resolved on their own as well. So those are the kind of things that came up organically in the committee. The other part that came up organically was, how do we onboard members? And Judith, unfortunately, her career has taken a good turn, and she's no longer with us right now, but she did a whale of a job, as I understand. I'm sorry I missed the plenary in July, but I understand she did. That's the kind of thing where it's member to member, it really, and those are, and so what I would like to, anyway, but Do you want to offer something, Bob? Anyway, so I guess what I'm reluctant to do at this moment is to get into the level of tactics. What I'm talking about is a strategic objective and just sort of how we think about the buckets in which we do this work. And so, you know, I've got a list here of some of the tactics we need to pursue. You know, again, some things need to be done professionally, some by volunteers, some are a hybrid. And again, you know, one of the things I think we want to do is try to leverage what's available to us. And, you know, one of the things, you know, we've done in a previous plenary is I'd said to the plenary, you know, if you work for a name brand corporation or organization that's here, can you please send me your media relations contact? I got one reply. And so that's fine, and I understand why that is. It's hard to connect across big organizations. You know, I talk to people who said, you know, I want to help you, but I've got to go talk to these 3 people. I've got to, you know, they have to do all this work. And I get that. So if I could ask you one tactical thing, it would be that. You know, again, a plea to the plenary, but I also understand why that's not a practical thing for a lot of people. So one of the things we've done in our, you know, I've done with some help from the NPO is to start looking at what are the contacts out there in the organizations that are members of IDESG and by virtue of being members are supportive of what we're doing. And so therefore, I mean, it's sometimes just a matter of alerting them saying, hey, by the way, your company is part of this great initiative. Take advantage of it. And so now that we're going to be developing some more communications tools and some more messaging, you know, we can actually have something to share with them. So we're getting a little more build out on the messaging with our friends from Wagner Edstrom. They're helping us with that. So I guess, you know, the thing I would look for, not to go on about this, but I think that is what we really need are some folks who are connected throughout the committees, who are willing to stand up and say, you know, here's what I'm seeing, you know, this is a potential issue, and here's how I think we could resolve it. Identify, you know, problems we're having connecting, and issues, again, member to member, I think is the most important thing that this organization can do amongst the membership in the plenary.
I have a clarification from Anne. I asked her for a clarification. So her original question was, who will control the metadata and information architecture? The plenary, the communications committee, or external people? And I said, you know, can you clarify? And she said, yes, media and communications will require analysis and a language approach for messaging. How those messages will integrate into search engines, etc. This is often referred to as metadata and controlled vocabulary. Who will control that?
Up until the last question, I think I was understanding what you're going. But Bob, would you?
Is this thing on? Yes, this thing is on. Hi, and thanks for the clarification. So you're right that the metadata that would be used, for example, to do search optimization to make sure that our results are widely publicized is something that we should be paying attention to. And I would assume, and to be clear, I believe no conversations have been had about that yet, but I would assume that the Management Council, if it contracted with outside staff to handle those sorts of issues, would make sure that that asset would transfer over if there were a change of contractor or if we were to bring it in-house.
I think that's really helpful, Bob. That's put things in a bit of clearer light for me. I think the only thing I would say, and happy to hear Jim's take on this as well, I mean, indeed, it's not something we've discussed yet, but it's down to the sort of principles that Jim was outlining in terms of division of labour and different division of responsibilities. What we're trying to do is identify where we can get the best out of the different areas. Where there is a volunteer effort of people within the organisation, we can mobilise those people and use them most for areas where they have the knowledge of the organisation, internal communications being one of the clear areas. Where it comes to professional, external communications, that's where we may be needing to raise the resources and look for contracting outwards. And this is to the point that I think Anne is making. Even if that's done, the responsibility for how that is done and who is in charge of that would remain within the organisation. So I think if the fear or the concern is outsourcing to a third party some sort of external messaging or social media management and other stuff without any responsibility on our side, those sort of things, and there's plenty of examples on the internet today where those have gone out of hand, we want to make sure that we don't get into that sort of situation. That's how I understand the question she's raising, and I think the responsibility remains within the organization. Bob, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, and the one other thing that I think you would probably want to say is that any assets generated as works for hire would remain property of the IDESG Incorporated.
I would like to say that, and you've said it for me, so I'll just echo it. Yes, thank you very much. But yes, it's important about asset transfer. That again, that's back down to the sort of core mission of the board of corporate governance, if you like, and those sort of issues about what you spin off, what you outsource or whatever, and what you hold on to is important. And anything around that are assets that we've developed and remain under our responsibility. I don't know if Jim.
No, I mean, I think that's right on. I would just also say this conversation underscores the need to have this done by somebody whose only allegiance is to IDESG Inc., not a volunteer. Because if it's a volunteer, then if they're busy or if they've got some other interest ahead of IDESG, that's not inappropriate. So I think that's why, again,
Right.
we need it done professionally.
And that just raises one last element, which I think I sort of highlighted broadly earlier, but I'd like to underline, and that is there is a difference in terms of what we do and what we put on the table between being a volunteer and being an elected member of the board with fiduciary responsibilities. Because, bluntly speaking, anybody can put volunteer effort into the organisation, and with the proviso that we have around our IP policy about putting stuff on the table and making it available to others, we volunteer, we put our time forward on not just for the value for the IDESG, but presumably because we want to have a bit of a profile for our own work as well. There is a slight difference when you become elected as a board member, because when you are in a meeting of the board, and I try to underline that at every meeting as the chair of the board, your principal responsibility there is the interest of the organisation and nothing else. And if issues come up where you feel conflicted by that, then that has to be dealt with by our conflict of interest policy. But I think the main concern I have, it's not a concern because it's not come up yet, but my main focus there is ensuring that when we have meetings of the board, that the discussions we have, the questions we raise, the work we do is really focusing on that common objective about what's in the best interest of the organisation. And that's something that I will strive to do. I think we're close to our wrapping up time, and I would just like to take this last opportunity to, before we move into for those who are interested in the Chair's wrap-up session, which will take place in room 119A, the first of the meeting rooms next to the lobby, just take this opportunity to thank some of the unsung heroes, whether it's Kay, Jeremy, Jim, Kim, and others who are serving on the Management Council and on the board, and are actually being put a lot of time behind the scenes in terms of trying to make this organisation work, and also trying in the best ways possible to do that in a way which advances the interests of the organisation. We don't always get it right, we're not perfect, but I think the important thing is that we're committed to ensuring the success of the organisation going forward. And with that, I'd wrap up the session. Thank you very much.
Yes, after all your socializing this evening, tomorrow morning we will start at 9 o'clock. And I believe, where's my GTRI representatives? There'll be some refreshments prior to that. So 9 o'clock is the opening session, and we will be in this room again at 9 o'clock. So if you could come a little early and get your goodies, and then we'll start promptly then. Thanks. And thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, well, this is not really what this is made for. It's just a mouse.
Oh, the Tuesday night social stuff. Well, that we really need to know.
So the bus is leaving outside here at 6 o'clock sharp.
Correct.
So there's no, and also it means there's no break between that and the
Oh, I didn't even hear that.
Where we have the...
We'll have to get one from the house.
It says it starts at 6. Anybody know what time it finishes?
When the,
When the beer runs out?
well, exactly.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
every good party.
Yeah.
No, it won't reach. No, don't hit that.